In Lecture 2, we will be discussing the elements of regulation. So now looking at the specific elements of regulation, you've got your three elements and I've highlighted them here: establishing, monitoring, and enforcing. So with regards to establishment, this is creating the rules for a particular industry. So in the financial markets, we have the Financial Markets Act, we have the Financial Intermediaries Advisory Services Act, we have the Long-Term and Short-Term Insurances Act. So depending on the sector that you're looking for, they will enact specific rules for that sector. Keep in mind that South Africa also has our constitution, so all the rules that are enacted have to be in line with that constitution. The second element, monitoring, this is to ensure that the rules are complied with. So for example, when you have the Financial Services Board, they monitor that the rules that they have put in place are being followed. If they are not, you get to the third element, which is enforcing of those rules, which is action taken against people that do not comply. So there can be fines that are implemented, you could be struck off an exchange, you can even be put in prison for contravening the Financial Markets Act. So when legislation or acts of parliament are set out, they are generally very broad and the wording is open to interpretation. So what happens is these issues that come up in terms of a piece of legislation will come up in a court case, and the court case will go and provide further guidance from what the legislation means. So the case will interpret the wording of the legislation itself. So our legislation, for example, talks about suppliers of services, capital requirements, this relates to Basel, dispute resolution, appeal procedure, disclosure requirements, complaints procedure, and the creation of an ombudsman and enforcement measures. So every piece of legislation has certain elements which are there, and again the legislation is drafted very broadly so that there is space to interpret it depending on the specific facts of the case. In South Africa, there are different acts for each industry, so this is why the FSCA administers very different acts. So they have different departments, which will be discussed later, which take care of different acts. They have conditions, they have notices, codes of conduct, and subordinate legislation. So the legislation itself, the Financial Markets Act, for example, is the main piece of legislation, but very often there are notes that are published to help people interpret those sections of the legislation. So the drafting process takes place in Parliament. At the moment they are drafting an amendment to the Financial Markets Act, and people that are there involved with the drafting need specific expertise. So they need to know the law with regards to how legislation is drafted, as well as expertise in the industry to ensure that they are looking after the consumer's best interests. When you talk about compliance, this is a word that comes up a lot. You have your compliance department, and what they do is they make sure that people are following the law. How do they do this? They monitor it. So you have to report to the compliance department to show that you are doing everything necessary to comply with the regulation. So for example, you do your auditing reports to make sure that all the information that you have disclosed in the audit is true to what the business is actually doing. Regulators will have access to the information, and depending on the firm or the industry, you could have an on-site compliance officer that sits in your office that you will report to, or alternatively you will report on a specific basis to the regulator every few months or every few weeks, for example, depending on the impact that your firm has on the industry. So regulators make use of some of the following options with regards to enforcement. They can refer you for criminal prosecution. If the case is a criminal case, there are specific penalties that follow. It could even result in jail time. They can withdraw your license to do business and wind your business down. A curator can control the business for a certain amount of the time. So a curator is a person that has been legally appointed in charge of your business to make sure that things are running as they should. Business rescue proceedings. So business rescue is a step that is taken before a company files for insolvency. So once a company sees that things are going wrong, they will go into business rescue and they have to shut down certain operations in order to continue the business, to try to prevent the business from becoming insolvent. There can be certain penalties, usually monetary penalties. It can go from thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, depending on the level of the crime committed. And there are also civil actions to compensate prejudiced consumers. So you must remember that criminal actions are brought by the state. Civil actions are brought by specific people. So even if the person is not found guilty in the criminal case, it is possible that they will still be held liable in a civil case and will have to compensate that specific consumer which they prejudice.